In 1691, Governor Ingoldsby's humble address to the king described New York as situate upon a barren island, and that the middle of the island is altogether barren. All the rest of the province, Westchester, Staten Island, and Martha's Vineyard excepted, consist of barren mountain hills, not improvable by humane industry. The governor and council did have a vested interest in the king, thinking they could not produce their own goods, and thus increasing expenditures and trade, being in the king's best interests, even closing their letter with a request for a fresh supply of stores, because the small quantity that had been brought over are mostly disposed of in the several small forts of Albany and Schenectady. Why do New York's resources always go upstate? He asked half jestingly. New York has nothing to support it but trade, the governor complains, describing colonial New York's economy, which chiefly flows from flour and bread they make, of the corn the west end of Long Island and Zopas produce, which is sent to the West Indies, and there is brought in return from thence, amongst other things, a liquor called rum, the duty whereof considerably increaseth your Majesty's revenue. This is the long introduction to the Barren Island, a little piece of land near Jamaica Bay. The recent book, Brooklyn's Barren Island, by Miriam Sikerman, describes Barren Island as a place where a group of new immigrants and African Americans quietly processed mountains of garbage and dead animals starting in the 1850s into useful industrial products. As described in A History of Public Health in New York City, Barren Island was the site of several factories engaged in converting offal, fish, garbage, and foul-smelling material into fertilizer. One of the worst plants, described as being in a very filthy and offensive condition, was forced out of business, and several others were ordered to eliminate certain offensive procedures. And so the history of Barren Island is one of endless creativity and usefulness at the bottom of the ladder, and how much everyone in the city who benefited from it disliked it. The first mention of Barren Island we could find in the newspapers was from 1825, when New York State announced that it belonged to them. Subsequently, Barren Island shows up in the early 1800s in the papers for pirates, for their subsequent treasure, and as a place for city pleasure seekers to relax, swim, fish, and generally party. As for pirates and treasure, Wednesday, August 10, 1831, the Long Island Star, Police. It will be recollected that the pirates of the brig Vineyard, when they reached Barren Island, were stated to have buried the money which they brought on shore with them, and that, though diligent search was made, no traces of the hidden property could be discovered. John Johnson, a resident of that island, at whose house the pirates lodged the night after their arrival, has been arrested, and is now in Bridewell upon information given by his brother that Wansley, one of the pirates, entered into an agreement with Johnson to share the money in case Wansley should get clear. Otherwise, Johnson was to have the whole, at the same time stating to him where the money was concealed. The reason of the brothers' complaint at this time is said to be a refusal on the part of Johnson to divide the spoil with him, according to an alleged agreement. The amount reported to have been obtained by Johnson is about $5,000. Monday, March 16, 1840, the Long Island Star. Money diggers. A few days since, I was in the vicinity of Coney Island and the Money Diggers, and learned a few particulars which may prove somewhat interesting. The place of deposit was on Pelican Beach, separate from Coney Island by Plum Inlet, and adjacent Barren Island. On this latter island was the small tavern house kept by a person who is supposed to have shared largely in the spoils of Gibbs, but after burying there, lost his landmarks and was unable to recover his money. The surface of about 5 acres of the white sand of this snowy beach has been disturbed, and at one time as many as 250 persons were at work. These worshippers at the shrine of Pluto were ferried over by Dutch fishermen in a small boat at the charge of a small sum on going over, but on returning had to submit to a quadruple exaction. Sharon, with his craft, made a full share of profit. About $7,000 have been exsanded, and the most fortunate hunter collected $2,000. There was no gold found as reported. The right of mine and thine was not vested in the discovery, but decided by a scrabble with fists and nails, strength and activity giving the larger amount to the more successful, as with boys scrabbling for pennies. Some ludicrous scenes occurred. One digger exposed the top of a bag, when to secure it, he immediately fell face down, covering it with his body for the purpose of securing the whole contents. He availed little by the attempt. Those near him extracted from under him nearly the whole of the dollars, leaving him about 2 hands full. A strong man with shovel or other implement would keep at bay those who might be near, as he would throw out the specie, and thus secure his discoveries. On the whole, it was a happy thing for the seekers, as many of them are fishermen and clam men. The coin are sought after by many as keepsakes, tending to keep alive the recollection of the horrible deeds of Gibbs and Walmsley. Certainly a taste which make it agreeable to its possessors to dwell on horrors, and which must have been possessed, not in an eminent but large degree, by the physician, who could have had a piece of Walmsley's skin tanned into leather, and wear it as a purse. A gale was the cause of uncovering some of the money, which was seen by one man. He was seen by another, who was attracted to the spot by seeing the first unusually industrious on the barren sand. Working till night, they separated on enjoined secrecy. The latter told his wife, the wife another woman, the women the neighbors, and finally it spread through counties. The tavern house has been left by the ones who entertained the pirates. Barren Island is only remarkable for its being covered with shrubby cedars, on which the crows that infest the cornfields of Long Island find their roosting places. Wednesday, March 2, 1842, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. More pirate money. During the late storm, more of the Mexican dollars buried by Gibbs and Walmsley were brought to light on Barren Island. It is said that some individuals have found considerable sums. In 1834, the Long Island Star describes a chowder party in company with the troopers on Barren Island. An 1851 piece describes the plentiful fishing grounds there. Saturday, September 20, 1851, the Brooklyn Evening Star. A party of 8 gentlemen from Flatbush and Brooklyn took a boat at Duryea Tavern, Sheep's Head Bay, on Thursday last, and anchored in the vicinity of Barren Island. In about 3 hours they took with hook and line 776 fish, with soft clam bait, consisting of bass, blackfish, flounders, porgies, etc. Commodore Robert Greenwood shows the fishing ground. In 1844, a piece in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle shows 2 pieces of property mapped out on Barren Island, belonging to George Lott and Peter Voorhees, but by 1849, the Eagle reports on a local scandal in the only house on Barren Island, owned by Anne Eliza Cheney. Monday, June 25, 1849, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. Before Justices King and John C. Smith, the people against Benjamin Ryder. Ryder was arrested on complaint of Anne Eliza Cheney of Barren Island for bastardy, Anne Eliza made oath that she was enceinte by Ryder, that means she was pregnant, and swore that he was the only man with whom she had been familiar. The case excited much interest among the Canarsie and near Rockaway people, and a great number of our Brooklyn boys, who have been in the habit of visiting Barren Island on sporting expeditions. There is but one house on the island, and that is occupied by Anne Eliza's father as a sort of hotel, where those visiting the island are compelled to stay overnight. 1853 sees Cheney still living on the island, having his chickens stolen. Mr. Cheney alarmed Mr. Fritz, a neighbor of his, who jointly made after the thieves. They caught the ringleader, whose name is Woolley, but the other two succeeded in reaching the small boat with which they went towards their schooner. Two boys who were left in charge of the schooner say they never reached her, and there is scarcely a doubt but that they met a watery grave. Woolley was taken to New Lots for next morning, where he was examined. It was in 1853 that the Voorhees land, now or late of Eliza Ann Voorhees, was sold at public auction when the mortgage could no longer be paid, and it must be at this time that the island became available for W.B. Reynolds to lease as a garbage dump. In 1850, the Tribune describes Barren Island's role in the growing city, while complaining about the amount of dead animals, butcher's blood, and other refuse in the streets, because New York's comptroller was not paying the bill to the private contractor who did the work, W.B. Reynolds. A month's bill for W.B. Reynolds' services removing roadkill to his reduction plant is staggering in the number of dead animals. 500 dead horses and cows, 100 to 200 dogs and cats, blood, offal from shambles, nuisances from soap boilers, and garbage and bones. For an example of how non-industrial soap was made at the time, we consult the WPA slave narratives from Georgia, where a man named David Goodman Gullins relates that in slave times, "We always had meat left over from year to year, and this old meat was made into soap by using grease and lye and boiling all in a big iron pot. After the mixture became cold, it was a solid mass which was cut and used for soap." These ingredients would not be much different for the industrial soap-making manufactories in Brooklyn, which produced endless nuisance complaints for smell. In this case, the Tribune tells us, "The offal and refuse is carried by Mr. Reynolds to Barren Island, just beyond Sandy Hook, where he manufactures from it Prussian blue, glue, bone dust, and manure on a large scale. He employs a steamboat and 2 sailing vessels in transportation to and from the island." But by 1852, the island started being used for garbage, when a huge quantity of corn lay in a rotten state in a store at South and James Streets, where 2 persons in the building had died of cholera. They take it to Barren Island. The 2 dead persons are a man and his child. The wife is sick and enceinte, the press term used at the time to mean pregnant. The 1,500 bushels of corn are described as rotten and smelling in the most horrible manner, and are then removed immediately to Barren Island by the steamboat employed for the purpose of removing all the offal of the city. An 1853 article on the New York horse trade ends, "After the animals are worn out, they are taken to Barren Island, where manufactories are employed in converting their remains into oil, manure, etc." A letter to the editor in a 1907 New York Times expresses the changing sentiment towards the island. "Two destructive fires and the sinking of a slice of Barren Island into the depths of Jamaica Bay within a period of only a few weeks gives rise to the thought that perhaps Providence has intervened to do for us what the city and state authorities have been unable to accomplish, Do away with this group of noisome factories at the gateway of New York Harbor. A History of Public Health in New York City cites an about-face in 1921 by the New York Academy of Medicine, who complained about living conditions among the garbage sorting workers on Barren Island, noting the poor food supply and lack of medical service. In 1915, Barren Island had 3 plants that were such terrible nuisances that they were investigated officially by the city. The 3 were 1. Garbage reduction plant, 2. Fertilizer plant, where garbage tankage is dried, 3. The horse plant, which renders animals hotel garbage and during parts of the year, fish. By 1940, the War Department wanted the island for its own, and in 1942 seized the island using eminent domain. Thursday, November 7, 1940, the Daily News. Barren Island colony faces final exodus. With rumors again hanging like a cloud over Barren Island that the isolated colony's inhabitants face possible exodus if Uncle Sam buys up the tract for the Navy or Coast Guard, old-timers are recalling the days when the island was a much livelier place than now. And to hear several natives born and brought up there, they won't so much mind if they finally are uprooted from their lifelong neighborhood. They miss the community spirit that flourished when the island folk numbered several thousand, and the incinerator, long gone, supplied jobs and also plentiful buried treasure in its refuse. The islanders, especially the women folk, still go out and dig for the remnants of old rings, eyeglasses, pins, and other incinerator leavings, but they miss the movies, dances, school, post office, and shop that formerly made Barren Island a self-sufficient spot. In those old days, there also were several taverns where the men gathered after a day's work, and everybody joined in ice skating parties, sleigh rides, and frost fishing. I wouldn't mind leaving, said a 30-year-old housewife. Her sister, also born on the island, when the spot really was an island before it was connected with Brooklyn's mainland at the head of Flatbush Avenue, echoed her sentiments. There's nothing here now, the sister said. Both women, like typical islanders, shrink from the spotlight and withheld their names. The island people are not talkative to strangers, nor some of them even among themselves. Most all have rosy cheeks, result of their country-like corner of Brooklyn. Most all the families have several children and several autos. The latter are a necessity for getting over to Flatbush Avenue where buses run. The islanders' first exodus occurred several years ago when the park department took over a large portion of Barren Island and the families were ousted from their homes. Many moved away. The few that stayed transferred their belongings to the present colony's houses. It's a healthy spot and good for children, the colony's mothers say. Electric lights, oil-burning stoves, running water make life inside the houses pretty much the same as elsewhere in Brooklyn. Outside, however, the difference is big. The dirt roads are unlighted, and at night, the colony is pitch black, save for lights inside the houses. Tuesday, August 6, 1940, the Daily News. Barren Islanders hunt treasure. Within sight of Gotham's skyscrapers, the search for buried treasure goes on daily. Barren Island, in Jamaica Bay, is the spot to dig for gold, silver, and gems. After big storms and sweeping tides, housewives, kids, youths, and old-timers become beachcombers and patiently turn up the damp soil for deposits originally left by refuse fill. Their chances of lucrative finds are still good, according to the miners. Only a few months ago, runs one yarn, a housewife dug up 2 diamond rings that brought her several $100s, and Mr. and Mrs. Walter Krause, who have been living on Barren Island since May, have a small box of articles to show for spare time digging since their arrival. Among the miscellaneous collection they've garnered is an old penny, thin as tissue paper, also a collar button, gold-plated wedding ring, gold eyeglass nosepiece, a gold stick pin without a stone, an amethyst ring, and a black carnelian stone. "Nobody knows the value of the stuff still buried here," commented Charles Smith, who's been associated with the island for about half a century. He formerly lived there, and in his house was the island's post office. He rents rowboats to fishermen, and like almost everybody else still living on the island, finds time occasionally to go out and dig. Take children, too. When somebody finds something, the news spreads fast, he said. Some women go out every day with their babies in carriages and dig. One woman has a collection of over 500 pennies, he added. Today's pickings are not as plentiful as those of years ago when the incinerator was operating. Smith remembers a resident who, according to legend, dug up gold articles worth around $2,000 over a period of 2 years. Digging for treasure is one of the few remnants left of the island's old life. For many years, it has not been an island at all since the causeway was built connecting it with the rest of Long Island. The official name now is South Flatlands. The post office is gone, and residents today pick up mail at Floyd Bennett Airport's administration building. The island's 2-story frame PS 120 is gone, and the youngsters go to school by bus to Brooklyn. Community Center gone. Gone also is the community center, started by the school's principal, the late Jane Shaw, who became locally famous as the guardian angel of Barren Island during her 18 public-spirited years there. And many of the original families who had lived there for years are gone, along with their houses. They were ousted by the city 4 years ago from the acres that the park department expects to develop someday into Marine Park. Only 35 families left. Today, there are about 35 year-round families. They have houses on hired land and pay a small ground or house rent, which old-timers point out emphatically means they can't be dubbed squatters. In keeping with the island's traditions, the exteriors of their houses are ramshackle. That's because they don't know when they'll be tossed out. Reports have it now that the United States Navy has its eye on the area in connection with aviation expansion. But also in keeping with tradition are the interiors of most of the homes. Many are beautifully furnished and include modern electrical equipment and oriental rugs. Recalling the days when treasure hunting was at its peak in the then isolated community, Smith brought out spoons that were picked up. He still uses them. They bore the names of New York hotels that have passed into limbo. It also seemed the area was reclaiming its pastoral past in the public's point of view. A daily news piece from August 1940 called Outdoors gives recommendations for fishing near the island. 7 weeks before Pearl Harbor, in a story sad and illustrative, a young man drafted into the war everyone could see coming killed himself in the weeds on the island. Friday, October 17, 1941, the Daily News. Up for draft exam, youth kills himself. A 22-year-old Brooklyn draftee who had been ordered to report for his physical examination yesterday at Fort J, Governor's Island, was found dead from carbon monoxide gas in his automobile at 6 o'clock last evening. The car, a sedan, was parked in the weeds on Barren Island, about 200 yards south of Floyd Bennett Field. A rubber hose connected the exhaust pipe and the engine. The car windows had been stuffed with paper. Frank Waltz of 556 Bainbridge Street, Brooklyn, was slumped in the front seat. Jenny Cabish, 19, of 21 Main Street, Barren Island, smashed a window of the car, turned off the engine, and called the police. An emergency squad worked for an hour before giving up hope. The youth's mother said he was scheduled to report at 9 a.m. yesterday for examination prior to his induction. She became hysterical when informed of his death. She blamed warmongers. After the Navy turned it into the Floyd Bennett Field as New York's first municipal airport and then a naval air station for the Second World War, Barren Island became the William Fitz Ryan Visitor Center, a park and recreational area. Miriam Sickerman's description of Barren Island as a place where a group of new immigrants and African Americans quietly processed mountains of garbage and dead animals into useful industrial products reminded us of a wonderful 2011 article in the Brooklyn Rail by Eleanor J. Bader, detailing the efforts of two people in Brooklyn to make recycling bottles and cans easier for the homeless, who saved them from landfills by removing them from the trash. Bader writes, Eugene Gadsden, known on the streets as the King of Canners, and Anna Martinez de Luco, a Catholic nun who became homeless in 2004, began brainstorming about ways to improve the canner's lot. The two of them opened a redemption center called Sure We Can, where people can bring their cans to be recycled without having to suffer the derision and disrespect that so many can collectors face when trying to redeem them at a regular store. De Luco is quoted as saying, Work is a very important part of our lives. If you have something to do when you get up in the morning, it gives meaning to the day. Canning is not the type of work that makes you tired. It's like treasure hunting, and it's good for the environment. The 300 or so canners who are a part of Sure We Can bring in about 500,000 pieces a month. Bader cites statistics from the Department of Environmental Conservation to illustrate the enormous impact these workers have made. Between 1982 and 2008, 90 billion containers were recycled, saving more than 52 million barrels of oil and eliminating 200,000 tons of greenhouse gases.